Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and welcome to my astrology channel. This is where I take a look at what's going on up there in the heavens and talk about it in general terms, also global terms. But also I like to take it kind of seriously. I like to look at things a little bit more in depth so you get a real understanding that astrology is this vast and beautiful subject. It's not something that is just for entertainment. It's got a lot going for it. So my main subject on this video is going to be the full moon in Virgo. But there's another equally important topic, and that is what I call the shadow cycle of a planet, in this case, Saturn. Now, this is something I've referred to on my website, Astrology. I talk about it on my Friday Bite, which is something I write freshly every Friday. And this recent one on the 21st of February took as my centerpiece the shadow cycle of Saturn in relation to Donald Trump. Because one of the most important things about a shadow cycle is when it begins and when it ends. And of course, the events at the time that it begins play into the whole development of those situations through, well, in this case, almost an 11-month period, which covers the whole period of the run-up to the election, which is why it's singularly important for him. But first, let's have a look at what I mean by a shadow period. This has everything to do with a planet's retrograde and direct motion. It's just an illusion that planets go backwards and forwards. It's to do with the relative speeds of the planets, but that doesn't make the whole idea any the less important. Right now, we're in a period of a retrograde Mercury. Very easy to understand a retrograde Mercury, very obvious. Lots of things with communication and travel become that little bit more complicated. It's hard to get from A to B, whether in conversation or in travel, without some kind of deviation, diversion, detour. The other thing, though, of course, there's always a plus with anything in astrology, and with a retrograde Mercury, we have an opportunity to reflect and review our decisions. But in a funny kind of way, all planets in a retrograde cycle have a lot to do with reflection and review. Let's take Mars, for instance, which will be retrograde later on this year. It's a time really to really hold in our firepower, to use restraint with our firepower, to perhaps understand that winning the battle isn't necessarily winning the war. So we pick our battles. That's just very much a retrograde Mars in brief. But of course, when we come to those slower moving planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and beyond, the effects are much more powerful and profound. They have a real effect on the big things in our life, the big cycles, the life-defining events, and of course also on those all-important world events, which also affect us as well. Now, what really happens on what we call a shadow cycle or a shadow period is the time a planet takes to go retrograde and direct over those same positions. So it turns retrograde at a position, goes back to a certain point, then goes forward again to the point at which it went retrograde. So in this particular Saturn cycle, we're looking at May the 11th, in which Saturn turns retrograde. It'll be at 1 degree of Aquarius when it does that. But then it's going to go backwards through the zodiac until it gets back to 25 degrees of Capricorn, where it was on February the 3rd. In other words, that is the beginning of the cycle, the beginning of Saturn's shadow cycle. It will end on January the 3rd, when Saturn again reaches that point. It went retrograde on May the 11th, 157 of Aquarius. And as you'll see, that's virtually 11 whole months. Now, central to that is the idea of when a planet isn't moving at all. It's stationary. It's preparing to go backwards. It's preparing to go forwards. And if we think back to the most recent station, which was of Uranus on the 11th of January, so many important, sudden, and unexpected, and we could say explosive events occurred, very much in line with planet Uranus. Let me refresh your memories there. We had the shooting down of the Ukrainian plane by the Iranians. We had the whole of the Russian government resigning because of what was effectively a power grab by Putin. And Meghan and Harry announced, actually on the day Uranus was stationary direct, the 11th of January, that they were stepping down from royal duties. And of course, that time, that period of mid-January, also the time of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, there was a lot rumbling on, crises after crises in the world. So we can see how important these stations of the planets are. Now, when it comes to Saturn, we're looking at the principle of boundaries. Saturn has a lot to do with law and order, both in the sort of global sense of things to do with the military and law and order, constitution, governments, that kind of thing. So we always look to Saturn's station as having some effect in law and government changes, and also important events that really affect us in the long term. In our own charts, Saturn represents the things we struggle with. They're often the things we fear, we find difficult. So we need to watch this planet's movement through our charts because it signals a period when we need to be kind of super effective with what our challenges are. Now, in many ways, Saturn is also a planet that gives us great rewards. Saturn is also associated with the harvest, and so we reap the harvest of our efforts. This is why this planet, also to do with age and time, has to do with karma, the reaping of our actions, the rewards of our actions. What goes around comes around. Chickens coming home to roost. So all these things have the flavor of Saturn, and they are really very important to be aware of as we go through this shadow cycle. Let's make it simple. Events that were happening around the time of the 3rd of February, we can extend it a bit to perhaps the middle of February, to the Valentine's period. Think about what was happening to you at that time, what struggles you had, what things were being built and put together, what things you decided were going to be important for you to strive for, what things you were struggling with in terms of finding were difficult. Because as Saturn now moves forward, and it will cross into Aquarius before it reaches its retrograde stationary period on the 11th of May, we will really be working on building up our strength in all ways you wish to think of: finances, relationships, work, health, well-being. This is a moving forward cycle. But at the same time, we will, of course, still encounter the odd struggle, and we must meet those things and deal with them on the spot, not, push them along. If we push difficulties forward to deal with them another time, don't attend to them, they'll come back fourfold as Saturn turns retrograde. So it's important to remember to deal with our difficulties, our shortages, our problems as soon as they come up. Now, when Saturn reaches the point where it will no longer be retrograde, it's going to turn direct. That's going to be on September the 27th. In that retrograde cycle between May and September, we're going to find out whether some of the plans we laid down, some of the efforts we made to acquire stability and substance in our life, the things that we wanted our life to take shape with in some way, we'll discover whether those things we put in were built to stand the test of time, were successful, or whether we've got to rework them. We may encounter failure. We may encounter disappointment. But it's how we handle that in that retrograde cycle. That's going to be from May to September. Do we sink like a stone and say, oh, not going there, I give up? Put our paws up like little hamsters? Or do we say, I'm going to rework this, I'm going to get behind it, deal with it? And the adjustments we make, the reviews we have, the reflections we have, still those same words we might use for a Mercury retrograde, but now applied to Saturn on a much bigger stage. That's what we put in, that's what we deal with, that's what we face on the Saturn retrograde period, part of this huge Saturn shadow cycle. From October onwards, we're moving forward again. So the things we put right, the things that were broken, we fixed, and now we move forward. And this could actually be a period of achievement. Now, of course, those things we haven't bothered with, that we thought, oh, I'll ignore that and leave with it later. No, we won't achieve with those. Whether we're talking about relationships, work, health and well-being, put a finance, everything across that spectrum that applies to the pillars of our lives. But if we've worked with it, put it in, then we will find achievement. And I think that's very interesting when we look at the situation with Mr. Trump, for instance, because he has a huge lot, a great deal of wood to chop between now and the election time in November, because I believe that at that point when Saturn was at its degree, where the shadow began, the actions he took then with the pardoning and the various actions in the wake of his impeachment acquittal, those are the things that will come back to bite him in the posterior in that Saturn retrograde cycle. So it'll be good to get that right. So we have a perfect model of what will happen. And also, I think we need to look at those dates, May the 11th, September the 27th, and of course then January the 3rd. But let's take 2020, for instance. Those are going to be key dates around which we'll want to watch for our own progress and our own stability, security, and success, as well as our model of these times, Mr. Trump. Now, of course, I said at the beginning that we'd be talking about the full moon in Virgo, and I need to get onto that. And one of the things about this full moon in Virgo, which is on the 9th of March, is not that it's just important for Virgos, it's important for us all. But for Virgos, it's a point of empowerment. You only get one full moon a year in your sign. And we want to really take advantage of when that full moon occurs. It's going to be a supermoon, so it will loom large on the night horizon, in the night sky. I don't think that necessarily makes its effect any more powerful, but we notice it more. And maybe because we notice it more, we think about the things that are appropriate at the time of a full moon. We close and complete, and we form endings. Particularly important for Virgo, and I think the other very important factor is to remember that theme of empowerment. Virgo, you're empowered at this point. And that means the will and the emotions are harnessed. And it means that the actions you take have real body and power to them. And especially if they're tied up with saying, we're reaching a conclusion here, folks. This is time to draw a line in the sand. For us all, let's have a look at what Virgo means, what the 6th house means in our solar cycle. It's all about service. It's all about what we think of service. It's a very important component of life. In a spiritual sense, it's savor. Our work is our spiritual path, if you like. We take our work, what we do with it as a devotion, what we offer up with our sense of service is our spiritual path, is our spiritual duty. When we take pride in what we do for others, what we do in a sense of service or work, then we're enriched. It's when we forget that we should take pride in what we offer up to others or what we do to provide a service that we kind of lose the plot a bit. So at that time of the full moon, we need to really reflect on what we do as a sense of service in our lives. And if we can find it and see what that is and offer ourselves up towards it, then we are enriched. Now, the other thing about this particular full moon is that it is up close and personal with Neptune. It's at the opposite point in the zodiac, from Neptune. And Neptune is the most inspirational of planets. It's the most illusory of planets as well. Sometimes we don't see too clearly when we have a strong Neptune. We misunderstand, we misread, we make missteps. And sometimes we're lied to and betrayed under Neptune, but most often we lie to ourselves and betray ourselves because we don't want to see the reality. Very important to remember this around the time of that full moon. But what I also think is important about this full moon and its closeness to Neptune is that it's about dreams. It is so important to have dreams, and it is important to build our dreams. And so that when we have a full moon connected to Neptune, we have an opportunity to realize our dreams, but also to see in which way our dreams are realizable, to give a boost to our dreams. Same principle here is the opposite. We see where our dreams are unrealizable, are unworkable. But that doesn't mean they're dashed. If we then give up on our dreams, that's wrong. What we need to do is review them and rework them. Make our dreams realizable dreams and work towards them. And that's this huge, huge message of this full moon in opposition to Neptune. Immediately after that full moon has occurred, Mercury turns direct. So we have this sense at this point of the year, there are epiphanies. There are moments of great vision, and that we can go forward from that point. I think that's a positive way to end my video to you, this particular video. As always, take care. Bye for now.